Welcome to the Stump 2020. My name is Herb White, and I am editor-in-chief at the Charlotte Post. And Happy New Year to each of you out there who are listening to this podcast. And we're going to kick the new year off. Obviously, we're in the middle of a campaign for president, county commissioners, what have you. But for our first podcast of this year, we have Jacob Hornberger. And he is a libertarian running for president. And some of you might be, who? So we will introduce him to you, and he can introduce himself and what he's running for, why he's the candidate that should earn your vote, and all the other stuff that goes into it. Welcome to the Stump.
Thank you, Herb. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Now, we have talked in the past about campaigns, and I know the first question that you're probably getting from folks is, who are you and why are you running for president? So help us out.
All right. I'm president and founder of a nonprofit educational foundation in Virginia called the Future of Freedom Foundation that has advanced libertarianism for 30 years. And I should emphasize that they're not endorsing my candidacy, but people can go to FFF's site at ff.org to get a sense of what my philosophy is and what I've been fighting for 30 years. But I finally decided that these Democrats and these Republicans are taking our country in such a bad direction that I decided to jump into the political arena and take them on directly and try to induce Americans to look at libertarianism, to look at my candidacy, because I aim to move this country in an entirely different direction from these Democrats and Republicans.
Now, when you say libertarian, I guess libertarian means different things to different people, as opposed to Democrats, who are generally seen as to the left of center, and liberal Republicans who are right of center and conservative. What is a libertarian? Is that in the middle, or does it take some the characteristics from both parties, or does it go in a totally different direction?
Totally different direction. It's an entirely different paradigm. For us, there's really not much difference between Democrats and Republicans. They sit there and fight amongst each other, but it's really a matter of they're fighting over control over what really is a very bad system. What we want is a different system. If you take, for example, foreign policy, you see the Democrats and Republicans engage in these coups, alliances with dictatorial regimes, regime change operations, Iraq, Afghanistan, assassinations. We oppose all that. We don't get involved in as to whether you should assassinate this person or that person. We say there should be no state-sponsored assassinations. There should be no wars of aggression, invasions, interventions. I would bring all the troops home from everywhere, South Korea, Cuba, Africa, Middle East, and discharge them. They're not necessary. They're causing not only damage to people overseas in those parts of the world, they're destroying our freedom here at home and our prosperity here at home. And so our paradigm is entirely different, a paradigm of non-interventionism from both Democrats and Republicans. And that's not the only example. If you go across any kind of issue, domestic, especially domestic issues, our paradigm is entirely different from Democrats and Republicans. We want to restore liberty, peace, prosperity, and harmony to our country, and our system is entirely different as compared to Democrats and Republicans.
So now when you talk about domestic policy, let me just throw one out here and get your take on it. Healthcare insurance. What is your stance there?
Entirely different from Democrats and Republicans. America had the finest healthcare system in history. When I was growing up, nobody had major medical insurance. Some people might have had catastrophic, but the reason for that was healthcare costs were low. They were stable. Going to the doctor was like going to the grocery store. You know, who has grocery store insurance to protect against soaring grocery prices? Nobody. That's the way it was. I grew up in the poorest city in the United States, according to the Census Bureau, in the 1950s, Laredo, Texas. The doctor's offices were filled with poor people every day. Nobody turned away anybody. Our hospital was providing free health care also to the poor. Well, that's the real meaning of life when you've got charity based on a voluntary basis. Medicare comes into play, Medicaid comes into play in the 1960s. That is what destroyed this finest healthcare system in history. And that's when healthcare costs started soaring. So when you see Democrats and Republicans coming up with their healthcare reform plans, they all assume the continued existence of Medicare and Medicaid. None of it will ever work. It cannot work. It's a socialist system. It's an inherently defective paradigm. What you need is to get rid of the cancer that afflicts this body politic, and that cancer is Medicare, Medicaid, and to a larger extent, all governmental involvement in healthcare. We libertarians favor a free market healthcare system because that's the only thing that works, and it's the only thing that's moral, because charity, helping others, should be entirely voluntary and never mandated by the government.
Now, let's throw out another one. Income inequality. Much has been made of that in terms of the income gaps between the richest Americans and everybody else. What is the libertarian stance on that? Should there be more taxation of the richest Americans, or is there a different way to go about it in the libertarian playbook?
All right, well, I'm more than a libertarian. I'm a Christian as well. And I take to heart God's commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. And so I favor a way of life where coveting and political stealing is not engrafted into the political system. I believe that people have a right to keep everything they earn and decide for themselves what to do with their own money. Now, to the extent that somebody's getting money illegitimately, like through government largesse, by using the government to take money from one person to give it to another person, I totally oppose that. But in a free market system, there is inequalities of wealth. There are people that are tremendously wealthy, but at the same time, you have a very strong growing middle class. And at the same time, the people at the bottom of the economic ladder are better off than you would have in a socialist system where everybody's equally poor, like we have in North Korea or Cuba. So there's nothing wrong with inequalities of wealth as long as that wealth is acquired legitimately in a free marketplace. I mean, after all, the poor are much better off in a society where there's inequality if they have a higher standard of living than, say, a society like Cuba or North Korea where everybody's equally poor, but people are starving to death. But the acquisition of that wealth has to be legitimate, not through what we call crony capitalism and using the state to line your own pockets.
So now, it's interesting you had mentioned that you are from Laredo, Texas originally. Tell us a little bit about your backstory. I mean, and again, with our audience and with a lot of Americans who may not have heard of you or the Libertarian Party, there's a reason why you are here today. So tell us about your past in order to get us to where you are as the presidential candidate.
Yeah, I grew up on a farm on the Rio Grande. And I was a Democrat. I ate stuffed envelopes for John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. I actually met Johnson at the LBJ Ranch at a campaign rally my dad took me to. And he asked me what I was doing for him, and I said I was stuffing envelopes for him. And then when I got back to Laredo after I graduated from law school, I got a BA in economics at Virginia Military Institute and then a law degree at the University of Texas. I returned home to practice law in partnership with my father. I was still a Democrat. I believe that government should help people out. I was the local representative for the ACLU. I was on the board of trustees of the local Laredo Legal Aid Society, which provided free legal care for legal assistance to the poor. And then I discovered libertarianism, and that changed the course of my life. And I realized that this is a paradigm, a system, a philosophy that could do more for the poor than any other thing that Democrats and Republicans were proposing, especially Democrats. And one of the things that caused me to start questioning the Democratic paradigm was that we had hired illegal immigrants on my farm, and they're the hardest working people I'd ever seen. And I saw the Immigration Service bust them and arrest them when I was a teenager, and I saw this tyrannical system that had been brought into existence to enforce immigration controls. This massive system that we have here that is supported by both Democrats and Republicans. And that caused me to wonder, maybe Democrats aren't really that devoted to the poor after all, because these were the poorest people in the world, and all they were trying to do is just work, and they're in jail. And I was representing them, a lot of them, for free, because I went to the local federal judge and I said, I'd like you to appoint me to represent these people for free. And then I discovered libertarianism, and that's part of my signature issues. I totally oppose this war on immigrants. It has brought death, suffering to innocent people all along the border. People dying in the backs of 18-wheelers and crossing lonely deserts, getting shot by immigration officials. As a libertarian, I favor open borders, free trade and open immigration, end President Trump's destructive trade wars against everybody, his sanctions and embargoes, and have a free market system where you have free trade and open immigration, open borders. Not only is that consistent with God's laws of love thy neighbor as thyself, it is the only thing that works, Herb. Nothing else is going to work except freedom and free markets. That doesn't mean that immigrants have to come over and become American citizens. They can retain their citizenship. If they want to apply for citizenship, fine. But at least with free markets, you end the death, the suffering, and the massive police state that they brought into existence in the American Southwest.
Now I know you're going to get some pushback in terms of, if you look at Europe and you look at European countries that have had so-called open borders and the terrorism threat, the stress that's caused with social services in those countries, there will be that argument. What say you as the counter to that?
A lot of that is aberrant migration flows that have been brought into existence by U.S. interventionism in the Middle East and Afghanistan. I mean, you see the massive violence and chaos in these countries that the U.S. is responsible for, with their invasion and occupation of Iraq, their intervention in Syria, their intervention in Afghanistan. So it produces these massive aberrant migration flows that never would have happened. You see it to a certain extent here in the United States, where you've got coups that the CIA is instituting in Latin America. You've got the drug war, which is the cause of massive violence in Latin American society that causes people to come over. So if you get rid of those things, you don't have a terrorism threat anymore. I mean, when I was growing up, there wasn't a terrorism threat because the U.S. had its Cold War against the Soviet Union. It wasn't intervening in the Middle East, killing people. We got the terrorist threat as soon as the Cold War ended, and they started intervening with the Persian Gulf War, the sanctions against Iraq, the invasion of Iraq. That's what produces the anti-American terrorism. So what I'm saying is that by ending U.S. interventionism, you eliminate the anti-American terrorism. You don't need a war on terrorism anymore, and you don't have to live your life in fear. You can have a normally functioning society where the private sector is liberated. You bring the troops home, but you liberate the private sector. People all over the world love Americans. They love tourists. They love culture groups. They love American businessmen. They just don't like the federal government, and there's a good reason for that. Well, now you're restoring a sense of normality to society, liberty, prosperity, harmony, where migration flows become more normal. People from Mexico come in, they work seasonally, they work 6 months, they make a lot of money, they return home to their families where they're kind of kings because they got a lot of money, and you end all this death and suffering and really a police state in the American Southwest.
Okay, so then I like to jump all over the place. So let's look at this from the international view, and you make a compelling and interesting argument in terms of American government and interventionism across the globe, whether it's in Asia or Europe or the Middle East. Now, some would argue an organization like NATO has kept the peace relatively stable for, well, I guess since 1945. Is a military and political organization like NATO needed?
Absolutely not. NATO's a Cold War dinosaur. It should have gone out of existence immediately when the Cold War ended. When the Soviet Union dismantled and the Berlin Wall came down and the Warsaw Pact got disbanded, U.S. officials actually assured the Soviets, Gorbachev, that NATO would not expand. And yet that's exactly what NATO did. They double-crossed them. They broke their word, which is not surprising. We see U.S. officials doing that all the time. They started absorbing Warsaw Pact countries and moving American missiles and bases and troops and so forth closer and closer to Russia's borders. Well, it was inevitable what was going to happen. As soon as they start to absorb Ukraine, which is what they were threatening to do, it was predictable that the Soviets would respond by invading Crimea. They weren't about to let the U.S. take over their basic Crimea, which would have happened if Ukraine had become part of NATO. And so you've got NATO that has produced this new Cold War. And it's really being pushed by the U.S. national security establishment, the CIA, the NSA, where the real predominant force of government is in Washington. Well, by producing these crises, what do? They gain new official enemies, where now Russia is now the new threat, or actually the renewed threat, because we lived under that with the Cold War for 20-something years. But that increases their budgets. That gives them the excuse for ever-increasing power, and that's all the taxation. We've got $23 trillion in federal debt, with President Trump adding another $1 trillion this year. All of this is manifested not only in this warfare state that we have, which is contrary to our heritage, Herb. Our heritage is a limited government republic, which is the opposite kind of governmental system from a national security state. That's the kind of government we had for more than 100 years. No CIA, no NSA, no Pentagon, no military-industrial complex, and no foreign interventionism. That's the founding principle that was abandoned by people in 1945, and I think it's the root of much of the chaos, violence, and dysfunctionality that afflicts our society today.
So let's come back to the American shores. And I noticed in your biography, and you talked about it a little bit, in terms of the war on drugs and mass incarceration. So those are issues that, especially in the African American community, are really big deals, especially mass incarceration, which is in a way linked to the war on drugs. What is it that you believe should happen to end mass incarceration? Should it just be an overhaul of America's drug policy? Should it just be an overhaul of all of what a federal crime is and the length of sentence, or what?
We should do exactly what we did with alcohol. When Americans made alcohol illegal, we got violence, gang wars, police corruption, all the things that are associated with prohibition. When prohibition ended by legalizing booze, all that went away. That's exactly what we need to do with the drug war. This is the most failed, immoral, destructive government program, or at least one of them in U.S. history. And it is, I hold, the most racially bigoted government program since segregation. There's a reason why this program, the war on drugs, is important to African Americans, because it is a racially bigoted government program. There's an African American scholar named Michelle Alexander that titled her book The New Jim Crow. And that's what it is. It's the new Jim Crow, and mass incarceration is at the heart of this. Because you look at the penitentiaries, they're filled with African Americans, and predominantly because of drug violations. I mean, I'm not saying that all cops are bigots or all judges are bigots, but we know that some of them are. And so you end up with a bigot with power that's going to stop an African American while walking, stop and frisk, that type of thing, or planting drugs in their car, and get praised for it. Several years ago, there was a case in Tollia, Texas, my home state, where a white decorated police officer rounded up just innocent African Americans in the poorest part of town because they can't afford the good lawyers, and sent them away for 10, 20 years, and it later turned out he had made it all up. And this has gone on for decades. So there's only one solution to it. Now, we know that the drug war has adversely affected people of all races, but they're disproportionately on African Americans. Right now, I learned at talking to a reporter at the Carolinian newspaper in Raleigh, an African American newspaper, there's an African American guy named Michael Holmes who got a 200-year jail sentence when he was 22 years old in 1993 for a nonviolent drug offense. Well, that's just vicious, just total viciousness. He's still in jail. He's like a model for what we libertarians are saying. There's only one solution to this: legalize all drugs. not just marijuana, meth, cocaine, heroin, opioids, the whole thing. Drug addiction belongs in the private sector with groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, narcotics rehab groups, church groups, therapy, counseling. It does not belong in the criminal justice field. And when you put it in the criminal justice field, you're going to end up with this mass incarceration of African Americans and others. You're going to end up with a rotten criminal justice system. And that's the core of the rot of our criminal justice system, both at the state level and the federal level. You legalize drugs, you get rid of this apparatus in the criminal justice system. You also get rid of the drug lords, the drug gangs, the violence, the robberies, the muggings that addicts commit in order to pay the exorbitant black market prices of drugs.
And I guess it would also eliminate the exportation of drugs like cocaine and marijuana from other countries, whether it's China or Mexico or whatever.
It would all be legitimate. It would be through pharmaceuticals or pharmacies. That's who would be selling the drugs. And that's the way it worked in America for more than 100 years. There were no drug laws until the beginning. And in the beginning, they enacted drug laws for racist reasons. They went after Hispanics and marijuana laws. Look what they did to Billie Holiday. I mean, okay, she's an addict. She's suffering from drug addiction. What good does it do to harass that woman to her death because of these drug laws or because she was addicted to drugs? So the only solution to this thing is get rid of the whole legal apparatus, and then things start flowing smoothly. If there's opium coming from Afghanistan, it's going to be imported through pharmaceuticals, through pharmacies. Addicts get good drugs instead of corrupted drugs that are killing them. And that's something beneficial. It's something humane. It's a humane way to treat drug addiction and drug abuse. I'm not saying that drug abuse is a good thing. We know that. We know it's ravaged people in the African American community. What I'm saying is it doesn't belong in the penitentiaries of this country. It belongs in the rehab groups of this country.
So now, education, which is always a big deal, and you are a product of American education, from elementary school to law school, and you look like you're a pretty prosperous fellow. But there are still issues in this country when it comes to education. What's the role of federal government, A, in education, and B, should the feds be involved, and should it be more of a local and state deal?
None and no. Yes, I grew up in the public school system, went through it all. When I returned to Laredo to practice law, I represented a school board along with my dad. We were lawyers for one of the local school districts, board of trustees. My sister was an elementary school teacher. My niece was an elementary school teacher. But we libertarians look at this educational system that the state runs. Now this is a state-run system. It's essentially a socialist system. It's based on the socialist principles of central planning. It's based on coercion, mandatory attendance laws. The funding is through coercion, through taxation. It's the exact opposite of a free market system, which is what we libertarians favor. So in this country, we have, for example, the separation of church and state. We don't want government involved in churches, and we don't want government forcing people to send their kids to church. And some people don't educate their children with respect to religion and God and so forth, and we tolerate that. That's what we libertarians say should happen with education, that there should be a separation of education in the state. Just no government involvement at all, federal level, state level, local level, a total free market in education. Now, why do we say that? Well, because freedom's good, and the free market produces the best of everything. Socialism always produces the worst of everything. And the people who have paid the biggest price for public schooling are the poor, especially in the inner cities. They get the worst kind of education possible, which is more like an indoctrination system. And that's where you find a lot of the drugs, too, in these state schools. We believe that the free market should be used in education. So we favor a total separation of school and state because we believe not only is that a good system, freedom and free markets, but it also produces good education. Okay, what about the poor? Well, where do the poor go to church? The poor find places to go to church. It's not just the rich that build the churches that go to church. There's a tolerance that people have, the wealthier people in society, saying we're going to build the churches and we're going to let the poor come in. We have to recapture that faith in ourselves and a faith in freedom and a faith in others that says that, yeah, okay, those people that can't afford to get an education, there will be groups in society that will help fund those educations through scholarships and fellowships. But that takes a faith in others. It takes a faith in yourselves. But even a faith the size of a mustard seed can accomplish great things. And that's what we libertarians favor.
Now, the skeptic would say, that all sounds great if you're going to leave it up to the free market. But inevitably, the free market will separate haves from have-nots. For instance, who's going to train the teachers? Who's going to employ the teachers? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody has to run schools. So would every school have a headmaster or a headmistress? Are you going to be able to hire the cream of the crop for a particular school, or are you going to be left with whatever's left or nothing at all?
Well, that's the beauty of a free market, is that it brings into existence a tremendous diversity of things, many of which we can't even imagine. That if you start out, for example, the automobile industry, when it was first coming into existence, sure, only the wealthy could afford those Ford Model Ts. But by buying those, then that provides the ability to start mass producing for the masses. And so now everybody ends up with an automobile. Same thing with computers. Only the wealthy could afford those computers in the early days. But all of a sudden, through mass production, we all have computers now, including very poor people. Same thing happens in education. Yeah, there'd be some very expensive schools, just like there's very expensive Cadillacs. Not everyone can afford them. But if you have a system where entrepreneurs are free to provide mass education in different forms to everybody, then everybody benefits, even though some people might be getting into Harvard or Columbia or whatever, where the rest of us can't afford it, or maybe we're not even competent to attend those kind of schools. The good thing is that you have a society where you have countless entrepreneurs that are vying for people's businesses, saying, hey, look, we've got this package, we've got this package, he's got this package. So you may have schools that provide music education, another school that provides religious education, another one secular, but then people have choices, and they're in charge of their children's education. And as you know, each child is different. Sometimes a child's education should be totally unique as compared to the other child. That a free market enables parents to make those decisions and evaluate each special child, and each child is special and unique, and instead of this cookie cutter mode that the state uses where everybody's the same, and it ends up destroying education. Look how many people graduate at 18 years of age that hate learning, that hate reading, that hate studying and learning, as compared to when from 0 to 6, all they do is ask their parents why, and there's this curiosity and wonder of the universe. All that's pounded out of so many kids. I say that sense of wonder of the universe can exist throughout one's life, and that the state should not be smashing that out of existence.
So in other words, get the state out of education, out of this venturism, out of, well, just about everything, if you're a libertarian.
Not everything, but
okay.
You're right. Out of the peaceful activities that mankind is involved in. And so you can see now that our paradigm is entirely different from Democrats and Republicans, and that from our perspective, there's no difference between Democrats and Republicans, because they all believe in this system of the warfare state, the drug war, educational statism, mandatory charity. But we do believe that the state does have a role of punishing real criminals like robbers and thieves and murderers and rapists, providing a judicial system where people can resolve their disputes, protecting the country if we were ever to be invaded, which is a non-existent possibility. No country in the world's got the money, the resources, or even the interest in crossing the oceans to invade and conquer the United States. But we do see a role for government, and that essentially is our heritage, Herb, a limited government republic. And we libertarians say, and I say, as part of this political campaign, we have a right to the restoration of our limited government republic. We have a right to the restoration of other founding principles. Now, we know some founding principles were bad. Slavery, crony capitalism, government-business partnerships, tariffs, land grants to the railroads.
Women couldn't vote.
Women couldn't vote, and they had their property controlled by their husband as soon as they got married. Bad founding principles, but there were also some good founding principles. Open immigration. America had a system of open immigration for more than 100 years. Sound money. We didn't have a Federal Reserve that plunders and loots people, especially at the bottom of the economic ladder through debasement of the currency. We had gold coins and silver coins. That was the official money of the United States. We had no drug war. We had no mandatory charity systems, no IRS. There was no income tax, no federal income tax for more than 100 years because people believe that freedom requires that you keep your money, you decide what to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the actual campaign itself, I know you're going all over the place to convince people that your message is worth voting for when it comes time to pick a president. Kind of give me an idea of what that is like, especially as a candidate who is not on the radar like the Republican incumbent and all those Democratic challengers.
It's tough. It's extremely tough. My essential message is, look, if you like the direction this country's headed in, vote for Trump or any of the Democrats. Doesn't matter. You're going to get the same direction. All they're fighting over is control and management over the largesse and the power. Who's going to get to assassinate people in the Middle East? If you want a different direction for America, then come with me. Because I'm talking about liberty, peace, prosperity, harmony, the good founding principles of America. Now, I'm here in North Carolina. I'm waging an active campaign because we've earned the right to be in your state's primary system. On Super Tuesday, people are going to be able to go into the ballot place and select a ballot from the Democratic Party primary, the Republican Party primary, or the Libertarian Party primary. If you're an independent or unaffiliated voter, you can vote for me. And that's what I'm asking people in this state to do, is give me your vote. And I'm fighting hard among African Americans because of this rotten criminal justice system and this drug war to bring an end to it. Because if you will help me win my party's nomination, which happens in May at our national convention, then I can bring this message into the general election. Because notice that you don't see anybody talking about the racial bigotry of the drug war. You've seen these Democratic debates. Not one single moderator has brought that point up. The people in North Carolina need, I think the American people need a libertarian candidate that's going to be bringing this message and challenging Donald Trump and whoever the Democrats bring as their candidate. It's in everybody's interest to do that. And so what I'm asking people to do is, okay, you can put your vote for Trump or the Democrats, and it's going to be one vote among a million. It's not going to make much difference. You come and vote for me, and you give me a large vote total. That's going to send a message to these Democrats and Republicans. It's saying we're sick and tired of this drug war, this mass incarceration, this Jim Crow nonsense, and now your vote's counting because by voting for me, you're sending them a message. And if anything, the Democrats and Republicans understand, it's the language of votes. They get real nervous when they see third parties getting large numbers of votes.
Now, that's an interesting point because you also look at North Carolina demographically. In terms of race, income levels, and politics, where you have more registered unaffiliateds in some places in the state. There are more of them than there are Democrats and Republicans. Is that something that you feel that as a libertarian that you can exploit because there is this growing class of independent voters?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's some libertarians that say, we should spend our times trying to get Republicans to come and vote for us or Democrats to come and vote for us. That's just nonsense. That people that are Republicans are generally going to stick with the Republican Party. My targeted audience is people that are dissatisfied with these two parties, and that's why they're declaring as independents. They're seeing that something's fundamentally wrong in this country, and those are the people that I would like to talk to and say, hey, look, we can move this country in a different direction. I mean, look, Herb, we live in a society where there's soaring suicide rates, especially among young people. I mean, what's that all about? When you hit 20 years old, 22, you're supposed to be thinking, man, I got my whole life in front of me. Yet you see these people checking out of life. This is almost a conclusive sign that there's something fundamentally wrong with American society. And so what I'm doing is going to people that are sensing something's wrong. They're unaffiliating from the two major parties because they're sensing that these two parties are leading America in a bad direction. That's who I'm targeting. That's who I'm asking people, come and vote for me, support me, and help me win my party's nomination. Then whoever you want to vote for in the general election in November is fine. But at least you have me in there battling against these Democrats and Republicans on issues that America needs to confront.
Are you looking ultimately to be able to stand toe-to-toe with Republicans and Democrats nationally come November? Or is it more of a, I don't want to say necessarily an insurgency, but is it on that level, or is it on the level of, I want to be able to get on that national stage and talk to voters right beside President Trump and whoever the Democrats roll out?
Well, that would be the ideal. I mean, they've locked us out of the presidential debates for eons, ever since the Libertarian Party got established. They keep raising the bar for getting into the debates, which is fine. I mean, we have to earn our way there, but we have no control over that. I have no control over that. The only thing I have control over is the truth that I speak. And we have to just let that settle out and see what happens. If enough people say, we're going to come with you, Hornberger, we're going to support you, we're going to vote for you, then we will be rising in the polls and we will be a player in the political arena. But I have no delusions of grandeur in this. I'm fighting for something I believe in, that I have fought for now most of my life, running this nonprofit foundation and now in this political arena. So if that shakes out where we stay at a low level, well, so be it. Nobody's guaranteed success or victory in life. What we have to just do is, and I keep telling this to the Libertarian Party, we have to just adhere to our principles. We have to fight as libertarians. And then the American people can make their own call, their own judgment. If they start looking at libertarianism, I think they're going to see this is the solution to America's woes. And when that starts happening and this shift starts taking place toward libertarianism, toward the Libertarian Party, toward my candidacy, then you will see us rising to the level where we are able to effectively challenge Donald Trump for what he's doing and what the Democrats are doing, whoever they nominate.
Okay. Well, this has been interesting and educational, and I do appreciate you taking the time to come in and talk to us. And Jacob Hornberger, who is the Libertarian candidate for president of these here United States, native Texan, educated in Virginia, and obviously making his way across the country trying to win his party's nomination. And thank you for listening to The Stump, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Oh, let's see, what else? And where else that you may download your podcast today and through the future. And we'll be here throughout 2020 to bring you interesting side notes and front notes, for that matter, of political campaigns as 2020 shakes out. We'll try to get some more presidential candidates on if we can. And certainly there'll be plenty of state and local races to be decided in North Carolina, which is a swing state, and a lot of national attention is going to be paid to this state. And with candidates like Mr. Hornberger here, it's going to be an interesting year. My name is Herb White. Check us out on our website, thecharlottepost.com, as well as social media with Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the list of usual suspects. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great day.